Dobré odpoledne, vážené kolegyně, vážení kolegové.
Good afternoon, dear colleagues, and all who are interested in the history of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. Let me wish you a warm welcome on behalf of the organizers of the conference, 100th anniversary of the founding of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. Welcome to the second panel entitled Political System, Czechoslovak Communism as a Radical Opponent and Usurper of Forms of Modern Parliamentary Democracy. You can watch the panel on the YouTube channel of the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes. We have a stream in Czech and a stream in English. They will be available after the conference as well. And if you want to ask a question or a comment, you can type your questions in the chat section on YouTube, and we will forward them to the presenters. So let us begin. We have distinguished presenters from both institutes, organizing institutes, and also we have a dear colleague, Marek Syrný, as a representative of Slovak historiography on our panel. We have 5 presentations here in the panel, and the first presenter is Stanislav Holubec. He's a historian. He's at the university in České Budějovice. He's interested in historical memory, history of the interwar period and post-communism. He is the author of 3 monographs: People of the Periphery, the Social Status and Everyday Life of Prague Workers in the Interwar Era, or We Are Not Over the Water Yet, Images of Others and Historical Memory in the Post-Communist Transition. His presentation is very interesting. It's about the early period, about Vrbenský. So, Docent Holubec, the floor is yours. But you have to switch on your microphone.
Pane docente, nezlobte se, byl byste tak hodný, zapnul byste si mikrofon. Děkujeme moc, jestli byste mohl začít znovu.
Please switch on your microphone and start again. Yes, I'm sorry. So let me begin again. I came to this topic while working on a biography of Lois Landštychová, who was one of the personalities of the independent socialists. The book will be published in the coming months in Lidové noviny publishing house. I also became interested in this topic because the Czech radical division of the Czech left-wing parties has deeper roots. As early as the 1890s, the National Socialists and the Anarchists appeared alongside the Social Democrats. While the former 2 forces were successful in establishing themselves on the political scene, the Czech anarchists remained a fringe group. There were anarchist groups that were created among young intellectuals. So there was some kind of second force on the left, to the left of Social Democrats. This force was never very successful. So because anarchists refused the idea of parliamentarism and political parties, but still they kept some membership till the First World War. There were several thousands of anarchists, of miners from North Bohemia, and hundreds of intellectuals. Before the First World War, there were young anarchist leaders like Vrbenský and others, Borecký, Vrbenský, and they were different in that they had university education, and their ambition was to transform the anarchist movement into a respected political force, but they were not successful. There was the First World War and repression. Many of anarchist activists were imprisoned, including Vrbenský and Borek. In prison, they made contacts with representatives of National Socialists. During the First World War, Czech society became more radical, and the anarchist stream became more mainstream and more respected. Then, when the anarchists left the internation, they decided to unite with the Czech National Social Party. In the early 1918, in the spring, they joined with other groups and created the Czech Socialist Party. In October 1918, many anarchists entered the National Assembly, like Stanislav Kostka-Neumann and also Lojza Landová-Štychová. Vrbenský became a minister in Czechoslovak governments. At first, he was the Minister of Supplies. During the radicalization, when anarchists merged with the mainstream, however, after the First World War, they were disappointed with the evolution, and they wanted the new state to be more radical. They wanted to expropriate property of the aristocrats and other steps. And so the group around Vrbenský and other anarchists became more and more on the edge. For them, social democracy was an anti-state force, not loyal to the Czech state, whereas Vrbenský's group wanted a program that would connect loyalty towards the Czech state and the radical anti-capitalist program. Could you please share your presentation?
Tak abychom si ukázali tady na začátky té vrbenského skupiny tohle.
These are the beginnings of Vrbenský's group. We can see the Anarchists group were quite small. This is before the First World War. You can see Borek, Vrbenský, and Lojza. They were publishing their journal. But as time went by, in the first parliamentary elections in 1920, they were re-elected in parliament, but it became more and more clear that they were isolated in the party. So gradually they tried they decided to become independent, and in spring 1923, they used the voting on the law, on the protection of the republic. They voted against and were expelled from the party, and they founded their own party, which they called Independent Socialists. They also linked with the so-called Independent Social Democrats. These were a few MPs who did not enter KSČ. So Vrbenský and the Independent Social Democrats created an MP club consisting of 7 people. And they wanted to create a 4th force on the left, which would be anti-capitalist, but also loyal to the Czechoslovak state and respecting Masaryk. A few months later, the electoral court took away their status of MP, so they were forced to look for civil employment.
Se Vrbenskému podařilo z těch zhruba 130 000 členů socialistické strany.
The Social Democrats had about 130,000, and Vrbenský managed to attract about 15,000 members, and mostly they were workers. They could not pay high fees, and so the party was not able to have hired employees, functionaries. They had only 2 or 3. They were not able to publish a journal. They only could publish a weekly. So it was really hard to build such a party. It's interesting that Vrbenský managed to attract quite a lot of members from the Socialist Party, about 15,000, but still it was a very small number compared to parties like KSČ or Social Democrats or the Socialist Party, who had many thousands of members. In spite of that, in 1923-24, Vrbenský still made efforts to build the party, but they were not very successful. For example, in municipal elections, they won only 1 seat in Prague. For some time, Vrbenský thought that the KSČ might be forbidden by the state, so the Social Democrats could become the main force, but this did not happen. And so at the end of 1924, Vrbenský's party started thinking about applying for entry into the Comintern, because the enthusiasm from the Soviet Revolution was more important to them than the KSČ, which was non-Czech to them. So that's why they decided to apply to Comintern. And they were accepted. The application was accepted by Kominterna, but there was a condition that the members could not enter collectively, but individually.
A tak i když ten vlastně vstup nastal v tom září 1925,
so in 1925,
využila propagandisticky, tak zároveň těch několik
they entered the Comintern, but the independent socialists were not elected to any. They did not get any major important functions or positions apart from Luisa Landová-Štychová. Vrbenský and others were kind of suffered in the Communist Party. From the perspective of KSČ, Vrbenský was a politician who failed, who did not bring many people to KSČ, and so the welcome was not very warm on the part of KSČ. This brings me to the final part of my presentation. So Vrbenský's group, actually not all members did enter KSČ. Some were later expelled. Vrbenský himself was expelled during Bolshevization because he did not agree with the attitude towards Masaryk. After the Second World War, the only one who had some career in the KSČ was Luisa Landová-Štychová. In her memoirs in 1950s, she tried to make the importance of Vrbenský's group more important. She said it was a secret task from Šmeral to Vrbenský to prepare the workers for entering the KSČ. And she said from the beginning it was not a serious project. It was she presented it in a way that they were from the very beginning they were secret members of KSČ, and she emphasized her own historic importance. In the 1950s, she did not become such an icon of the Stalinist regime like Marie Majerová, for example. Her memoirs were never published. She remained member of the KSČ till her death, but she always felt quite marginal in the party. If we look at Vrbenský's group, we see that it was different from most members and voters of KSČ. They were mainly intellectuals, journalists. So in the Communist Party, which was really based in the workers' movement, they were always seen as suspicious. None of them had a bright career in the KSČ. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your interesting contribution on Luisa Landová-Štychová. And also thank you for respecting the time limitation, and sorry for interrupting you 2 times. I hope we will have no more technical difficulties. And now I would like to present our next speaker, Petr Anev from the Institute for the Study of Totalitarian Regimes, who researches political parties, not just the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia.
So he will speak of the Independent Communist Party and the turn of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia to the left within 1924-25. So we are in mid-1920s. So slightly different topic from what we have heard previously. you have the floor. Thank you. In my paper, I will speak about the independent Communist Party founded by Josef Bubník and other representatives of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. The Independent Communist Party is sometimes mentioned in literature, but it hasn't been studied until now. So hopefully this contribution will improve that. It is a group that had separated from the KSČ and which, when founded in 1921, was the major political party of the First Republic. It had about 350,000 members, and in international comparison, it was the largest communist party following Russia and Germany. It is necessary to know that in such large party, there were obviously several groups. There were faction fights, animosities between the right and the left wing of the party. And these two wings of the Communist Party were different in their view of some key questions. The right wing wanted to be less independent of Moscow, whereas the left wing wanted to be more Bolshevist and more under Moscow. Bohumír Šmeral was on the right wing. There was also Antonín Zápotocký and others, whereas the left wing was led by the General Secretary Jílek, then Josef Hagen and others. So the right and left wing differentiated in many respects. The right wing counted on revolution not being possible anytime soon in Central Europe, whereas the left wing wanted to have the immediate revolution and to reach communist goals. So the right wing between 1921 to 24 in the Communist Party had a majority, a clear majority. Otto Bauer, a representative of social democracy, said that he knew only two good social democratic parties. The best one, of course, is the Austrian one, and then it is the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. So this illustrates quite well the situation in the Communist Party back then. At the Second Congress, there was a major shift under the pressure of Moscow. The Communist Party was forced to accept a left-wing Politburo and an executive committee. And he, the leftist, had 18 votes compared to 14 in the Politburo, and a similar ratio of representation in the executive committee. So this is when actually started the Bolshevization of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. And the right wing became just a small fraction of revolutionaries. Part of the right wing did by Josef Bubník left the party. Some remained, such as Šmeral. Others left in the second half of 1920s, and a largest group left the party where Klement Gottwald and his people took over the party. So Josef Bubník was expelled from the party several months after the Second Congress on February 8, 1925, by the left-wing Politburo. And it was for plotting a split in the party and obstructing preparations for anti-poverty demonstrations that took place on the 10th and 15th February 1925. Bubník was expelled soon after. It is a question whether these reasons given were true. He said that they weren't. Some evidences suggests that it was so. However, the expulsion of Bubník caused quite an anxiety in the party. Many supported Bubník, be it regional leadership of KSČ in Kladno and Brno. Many individuals were against his expulsion, and also the main representative of the right wing, such as Šmeral or Zápotocký, they were also against. The expulsion of Bubník brought about a crisis in the party called Bubnikiad, and at the conference of Prague functionaries on February 25, 1925, there was an accusation launched against representatives of the left of the KSČ for embezzlement of party money in support of Bubník. On March 1st, the expulsion of Bubník was accepted by Prague Regional Organization, following a confirmation of his expulsion at the end of February, and also expulsion of accused leftist leader Julius Verčík. Then Bubník was replaced by Zápotocký. The events that took place were dealt with at the session of the 5th extended plenum of the executive of the Communist International in March to April 1925. Members of Brno Group who wrote Brno Memorandum stood behind Bubník in his support, but this was rejected, and it was recommended to go as one in the bloc of the left center. In Moscow, they had nothing against Bubník, nor Verčík, whose expulsion was then annulled. Following these events, the groups of supporters of Bubník established an independent parliamentary club of independent communists. So Josef Bubník and German communist Franz Warmbrunn established this new club, and then there were other former communists joining them, communist deputies joining them, 8 of them in the total, which was roughly 1/3 of communist deputies in General Assembly. There was also a former Catholic modernist and editor-in-chief, Jaroslav Rouček, Josef Teska, who was a former member of a radical wing of the social democracy. He was later on a Communist Party member between 1932 to 35. Sorry, 23 to 25. At the beginning, it seemed that the Independent Party will have some support. It was publishing its own journal called The Voice of Truth, which was a daily for some time. They also published a magazine called Rovnost, Equality in Brno. Organized many publicly accessible meetings. One of those was held in Prague, Žofín. Here, Bubník had to face many members of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia who attended these meetings and with the aim to harm these meetings. Bubník said that if protecting the interests, fighting for the interests of the working people was seen as opportunism, then he was an opportunist. And if it is a sign of being right-wing, then he is a right-wing. The Independent Party had to deal with lack of finances in comparison with the Communist Party. It tried to get funds from its members and also from Czechoslovak political representatives. Bubník was a great idealist in this matter, but Farmbrunn was negotiating with informers of the castle to support the Independent Party. Antonín Klimek describes it, the fight for the castle, and it is indeed true that Beneš or Jan Masaryk did support financially the Independent Party. Bubník's party was officially founded at Empire Conference on June 20-21, 1925. Bubník was the leader of the party, and Míla Kremichová, a former feminist activist, was also part of the establishment. And the party kept creating its organization, but in August it still had only 1,500 members, which was very little compared to over 100,000 members of KSČ. In parliamentary elections, the movement failed. It had even worse results than expected, not even 8,000 votes. For the elections, Bubník's party joined the first autonomous Orthodox party to increase their chances. But following this fail, the Independent Communist Party was dissoluted in December 1925. Many of its members joined the Social Democrats and others remained indifferent, Bubník included. So this would be the main information concerning the Independent Communist Party. And if you have any further questions, then of course I will answer during the Q&A session. Thank you for your attention. Thank you for your contribution. It was interesting to hear about the negotiation of support before the elections, and thank you also for keeping the time. So let's continue.
So let me now welcome our next speaker, Marek Syrný from Matej Bell University in Banská Bystrica. I know he also works at the Museum of Slovak National Revolt. He focuses on the history of 20th century, especially 1938 to 1948. He's also author of works on the Communist Party of Slovakia and a publication about Gustav Husa. His presentation is entitled The Communist Party of Slovakia and the Application of Standard and Non-Standard Political Parliamentary Practices in the Period Between the Liberation and the Gain of Power. The floor is yours. Thank you. Good afternoon. Of course, my topic is a bit different. So now we are after the Second World War, between the liberation and February 1948. Let me begin by a short reminder or the context. So what was the situation of Slovak communists after the Second World War? In the Slovak environment, it was quite a successful party. They were usually the third or the fourth in elections. The Social Democrats followed closely with 1% less, so they were more successful, left party, until the second half of the 30s. They were an anti-system party. It was seen like that. It was seen like that by other parties or political movements. They refused to cooperate with other political parties, but this changed in the 1930s, 1940s, nearing Munich, 1938. So there was a change in the attitude, also the attitude of the Comintern towards Social Democrats changed. Slovak communists had a different coalition potential than before, of course. The Communist Party of Slovakia was at the time a branch of the Communist Party of Slovakia. It was created when the Independent Slovak Communist Party was created with a separation of Czechoslovakia. This was quite radical, also in terms of staffing, of the management of the party, also in terms of ideology. In 1939-40, it wasn't clear what the end of the war would be like. and the Slovak state was not really in the way of Slovakia. That was the view of the Slovak communists.
Takže on predpokladal, že je správna doba už cez vojnu presadzovať komunizáciu.
So the idea was that society should be communized already during the war. And according to the communists, Slovakia should become part of the Soviet Union. And at the time, the Soviet Union was only a few dozens of kilometers away. This changed very much after the arrestations of Slovak communists during the war. And from 1943, there were completely new leaders in the party, young intellectuals, lawyers, and they had a different perspective on the state compared to worker cadres. In the interwar period, Karol Schmidtke arrives from Moscow with instructions on how to continue. He brings the concept of National Front, a broad coalition of anti-fascist forces.
Komunistická strana sa postupne akoby vymaňuje z toho vnímania ako antisystémovej a sektárskej strany, začína hľadať.
The Communist Party ceases to be anti-system.
V slovenskom prostredí fakticky tým najvýraznejším sa stávajú potom agrárnici, ktorí boli.
And agrarians were a big supporters. Who were in the resistance movement. There was a number of persecuted communists. And I also have to mention the propaganda against different resistance groups. So we can say that communists were still visible in Slovakia in the resistance movement. On the other hand, they were persecuted a lot. But thanks to the persecutions, they were seen as those who contribute the most to the resistance and who is not afraid, even if it means persecution. Then there was the Slovak national uprising. The communists entered the government. Then there was the defeat of Nazism, and we arrived to the period after the war. The strategic goal was to install communism and gain power and the dictature of proletariat. This goal remained. It's only the tactics that changed. The communists managed to unite with social democrats and the trade unions, so they occupied the whole left, and this enabled them to determine the post-war politics. Their main other objectives were equality of Slovaks with Czechs, there were reminiscences to Austria-Hungary. They did not use the notion of federation, but In fact, they wanted a federation of Czechoslovakia. And as for the socialization or socialism, the program was more social democrat. No, it was not so radical. The state administration or state power should be given to the people. So it was, the notion used was the people's democracy as opposed to capitalist democracy. So the ordinary people should have the power in the form of national committees and through changing the whole political system. Aside from 1948, the most important period is the first post-war year, the beginnings. At the beginning, communists used classical parliamentary practices. They used propaganda, promoting the party, using solutions popular at the time, focusing on issues like the national question, the division of property, land reform. There were the very popular programs of socialization, improving the position of workers, peasants. At the same time, we have to say that in these early stages already, there were some radical elements as well, or radical actions on the part of Slovak communists. What helped was that in the first post-war months, there was no political pendant that would be equal to them, that would be able to criticize them. So it started already in October 44, 45. Communists already had built their bodies on all levels, the levels of districts, regions, on the level of the state. The Democrats, who were the biggest opponents of communists after the war, had a delay compared to communists, and also they had to face some obstacles from the communists who already had the power. And communists were able to criminalize their opponents. They also used the Red Army, the NKVD, or the Red Army itself. So that was the post-war period, and it was very easy to discredit any unwanted critic from Social Democrats. Dozens of activists were sent to Soviet camps, and this was mainly a warning for the others. I'd like to mention strong voluntarism of national committees. When the communist candidates had a majority, there were actually only two parties. So if the communists won, they tried to make the national committees fully communist without any other representatives of other parties. Also, the land reform was carried out with no basis in the law.
To znamená, že nie vždy veľmi dbali na to, či ten, ktorý človek alebo obvinený skutočne pomáhal tomu režimu alebo pomáhal nacizmu. Častokrát sa samozrejme they easily discredited any opponents or critics by saying that they collaborated with the Nazis, for example, regardless if it was true or not. The center of this activity moved gradually to Prague and to the Czech part. The management of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia wanted to have control and power. They wanted to choose the right tactics for gaining power. It's a fact that radical promotion of the afterwar period in Slovakia created quite a strong aversion in Slovakia because Slovak society was mostly a peasant society and only a small part of society was radical. This aversion was related to the church, the persecution of the Catholic Church, some laws that were adopted by the communists were not welcomed by the society, like the nationalization of education. Then there was the question of federalization of Czechoslovakia. The Prague center was aware that it had other issues to deal with than this, and they the Czech center knew that they needed the collaboration of the Slovaks. So the federalization of Czechoslovakia was not on the agenda. What was on the agenda was gaining power. That was the main objective, and everything had to be subordinated to this goal. And there was a change in the leadership, so the post-war radical leadership was then replaced by leaders who were closer to the center. They spent most of the time in Prague. For example, William Široký, the deputy prime minister, who did not take part in the uprising. He was either in prison or in Moscow. So he wasn't so much aware of what happened in the past, and he didn't have a problem with making some purges in the party and fulfill the tactics focused on taking the power. Of course, everything focused on the elections in 1946. The post-war
tactics was based on the parliamentary takeover of power, not a revolution, non-violent. All the propaganda, all the activities focused on gaining majority in Slovakia. And this was not possible due to the structure of Slovak society, because 3/4 of the society were peasants. Pre-war communists and social democrats acquired about 30% of votes. It was the same as what the left got before the war. So they were not able to speak to the majority. So it's the anti-communism and conservatism that won in Slovakia. Of course, this situation has to be tackled somehow. Here we can compare this to the Czech environment. So here we have some basic facts. Of course, the Slovak environment, the Slovak population is much smaller compared to the Czech lands. I'm also showing here some examples of press. The Democrats always tried to appeal to all social groups without making big differences. Of course, they were aware that it would be difficult for them to appeal to workers. On the other hand, the communists tried to appeal to small property owners like peasants. They also organized mass activities focusing on peasants. They were aware that it's not so important to have parliamentary majority. What matters is whether you can use all groups that have some public power or political power. In this case, these were partisans, resistance groups, and also trade unions. And the communists were able to attract these and use them later. Communists have managed to gain power over state security in Slovakia. The Democrats accepted that state security, that the police would be there field. On the other hand, the state security was a domain of power of the communists. The methods used by the communists to disqualify Democrats after the 46 elections were mainly focused on using the fact that the communists won in the Czech lands, that they were able to criminalize the Democrats. The communists were saying that Democrats were dangerous for the Slovak state. So there was a propagandist campaign that used groups outside of the Communist Party. Partisans, trade unions, and others. I think all this is quite clear. Then there was the political crisis, and the Slovak communists, with the support of Czech communists, managed to change the dominance of Democrats. There was a strange situation because the Democrats were the strongest party in the parliament, but in the public space they had almost no presence. No power. In February 48, it was the non-parliamentary methods, like accusations. They used the fact that the communists controlled the security apparatus, so they constructed these accusations to attack Democrats. So in Slovakia, it was a small revolution. There were armed groups of partisans and members of the state security. And this is a summary of my contribution. So generally we can say that it was a combination of parliamentary and non-parliamentary, non-standard methods. Somewhere in between, I place the creation of pro-communist structures in individual central state and public institutions that were not illegal, but they were not standard. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you too for your contribution. I like your precise information about the changes that were going on in Slovakia. It's also very good that we heard that the history of the Slovak Communist parties is an important part, so it gives a wider frame to the history. Let's now pass on to our following panelist. I would now like to ask Dr. Jiří Pernes from the Institute of Contemporary History, who has published a number of articles and papers and books on the Communist Party and the communist regime. Except for working as a researcher in the Institute of Contemporary History, he also teaches at the Faculty of Arts at University of J.E. Purkyně in Ústí nad Labem and in Masaryk University in Brno, and he will speak about the Communist Party and the takeover following the coup in February 1948.
Já se omlouvám za malou technickou pauzu.
Sorry, there is a short technical break. There is a mute button on the bottom left. I'm sorry, I'm not very skilled when it comes to computers. As an introduction to my presentation, I have to say that there was a hidden conflict between the policy of the specific Czechoslovak way to communism that was promoted by the Communist Party before 1948 and the Soviet pressure of abandoning this path. Stalin was not much interested in keeping these paths, and it was much visible in the Communist Party and much present when the class struggle sharpened later on. But let's look at the forces that the Communist Party uses to take over the state, its apparatus, and other forces. So when the democratic forces, including the president of the Republic, Edvard Beneš, handed over power on a silver platter to the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia in February 1948, its leadership had no choice but to take effective steps to consolidate and maintain it for years to come. The communists would not have been able to seize power if they had not been supported by crowds of thousands in the streets and squares of Czechoslovak cities, if they had not been marched through by armed detachments of the People's Militia made up of workers from local factories, if action committees of the National Front had not spontaneously sprung up all over the country, throwing their fellow citizens out of their jobs and positions. This by no means means that all Czechs and Slovaks wanted a Communist Party government. On the contrary, there was a large number of people who were well aware of the consequences of the establishment of a totalitarian communist regime. But they were fewer of them than those who aspired to the rule of the Communist Party. They were less organized and had much worse leadership. The Democrats in February 1948 and in the days that followed reaped the fruits of the unfortunate policies they had pursued for nearly 3 years. Since 1945, they allowed the communists to take control of the police, which they put on alert immediately after the democratic ministers resigned and occupied strategic positions in the capital. The communists controlled the radio, the Czechoslovak press office, and were able to paralyze the press of the democratic parties almost immediately. With the help of their members and agents in the highest military positions, they successfully knocked the army out of the game, even though there were many officers and soldiers willing to fight for democracy. February 1948 was above all a failure of democratic elites. The leadership of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia was aware of the important role that Parliament could have played in resolving the entire crisis and made considerable efforts to prevent it from taking an active role. It succeeded. Moreover, the Communists proved that the deputies of the democratic parties elected in the free elections of 1946, who, in total, although the Communists won the elections, had a majority in the National Assembly, gave the government of the revived National Front with Gottwald at its head a vote of confidence in March 1948 and enabled it to take power unhindered. And a few weeks later, they even approved the communists' draft of the new constitution of the Republic. Active opponents of communist policies were systematically monitored by the state security since 1945, and after the resignation of the democratic ministers, they were subjected to undisguised surveillance. The police watched the doors of their apartments, registered their visits, and brazenly followed them on their travels outside their homes. Immediately, even before the President of the Republic accepted their resignation, they were prevented from exercising their functions. The non-communist parties themselves were also excluded from active participation. The leadership of the Communist Party immediately activated its network of agents, whom it had deployed or enlisted to work with them after 1945, and help them to take over the leadership of these parties. After a brief hesitation about whether to end their activities and establish a one-party system along the lines of the Soviet Union, the decision was made to let them continue to exist as the gears of communist politics and to use them as a backdrop for pretending the continued existence of political pluralism in Czechoslovakia. The non-communist parties lost most of their members. Either they left on their own, some even defected to the Communist Party, or were expelled. The admission of new members of these parties was not decided by the relevant party organs, but by district action committees of the National Front, controlled, of course, by the Communists. They were held by the Socialist Party. Moreover, the party subsequently renamed itself the Czechoslovak Socialist Party in order to recall its pre-February past as little as possible, as did the Democratic Party, which adopted the new name of the Slovak Revival Party. The Czechoslovak social democracy played a strange and totally undignified role. In the days of the government crisis, it supported the policy of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, and only on 25 February its ministers Václav Mayer and František Timeš resigned, reversing the ratio of resigning ministers in favor of the Democrats. However, it was already too late. This impotent policy at decisive moments only reflected the internal split in the party, whose members were defecting to the Communist Party by the hundreds or even in entire organizations even before February 1948. Subsequently, the old communist agent Zdeněk Fierlinger returned to its leadership, who, together with others such as Oldřich Jon, Ludmila Jankovcová and Jiří Hájek, created the conditions for the merger of social democracy with the Communist Party. This took place in June 1948, but it was not a real voluntary merger of the two parties, but a staged spectacle in which social democracy was liquidated, some of its members transferred to the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, and others remained in the party, of which a large number came under the surveillance of the secret police. Under these conditions, nothing prevented the leadership of the Communist Party from proceeding with the parliamentary elections planned for 1948 before the coup d'etat. They were held on May 30 as originally scheduled. There were still some illusions in the leadership of the Communist parties at this time about the possibility of its own specific path to socialism is evidenced by the resolution of the Presidium of the Central Committee of KSČ of March 22, 1948, saying that the Communist Party is going into the elections with an independent candidate. This implied, of course, that the other parties would also run separate candidates. Therefore, the resolution even included the decision not to make obstacles to other parties, being able to stand on the contrary to help those parties which could not stand a candidate on their own. However, as early as April 5th, the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Communist Party of the Czechoslovak Republic decided to change the previous resolution and to put up a single National Front candidate. Its essence consisted in the fact that 70% of the seats on it were occupied by the Communists, with 10% each guaranteed to the non-communist parties of the revived National Front. During these elections, voters had the last opportunity to go behind the screen to modify their ballot and also to drop a white ballot paper into the ballot box instead of a single candidate. At the same time, the Communist Party leadership took advantage of the opportunity provided by the law on the purification of public and political life to deprive of the right to vote persons whom the local election commissions had identified as the most aggressive exponents of reactionary, bourgeois and fascist forces. We know from archival documents that the communists counted on this as an important mechanism for ensuring a favorable election result. For example, at a meeting of regional political secretaries on March 1st, 1948, the Plzeň secretary Václavu stated unequivocally, I quote, "It will be necessary to deprive many people of the right to vote." End of quote. In the report on the course and result of the elections that the regional secretariats of the party sent to Prague headquarters, we cannot find specific data on the number of citizens who were prevented from voting by local election commissions for political reasons. Nevertheless, in some documents, this figure can be found. E.g., for example, in the report of the district committee in Mikulov in South Moravia. According to this report, 4.8 voters were deprived of the right to vote, while only 3% of voters cast a white ballot. Thus, those who were deprived of the possibility to vote by the communist regime were more than those who decided to express their disagreement with the unified list of candidates of the National Front. The election had turned out, of course, as the communists had hoped. The united list of candidates of the National Front won 86.6% of all votes cast and even 87.1% in Czech lands. Only 9.3% of the voters cast white ballots and 3.6% of the votes were invalid. It is undeniable that the Communist Party resorted to falsifying, or as their leaders said, altering the election results. When the Presidium of the Central Committee of the Communist Party discussed the course of the elections on June 4, 1948, Slansky stated that, I quote, "The adjustments that were made down below are difficult to estimate. The regional secretaries will confidentially supply us," and admitted that, I quote, "the bigger cases were in Prague. We reckon that they were probably the biggest adjustments. They put it on account of non-participation," end of quote. He was then interrupted by Gottwald, who said resolutely, I quote, "I beg you not to talk about the adjustments at all, even among yourselves. In particular, let the leading comrades not admit the idea of any possibility of adjustments, but strongly oppose it," end of quote. The manipulation and falsification of election results is also evidenced by other contemporary testimonies of persons who were directly involved in the organization of the elections. An analysis of this situation shows that the National Front Action Committees were the actual executors of the coup d'etat. These were illegal groups of Communist Party members and their collaborators or sympathizers. In contravention of the applicable regulations and legal norms, they deprived duly elected or appointed officials of their positions and installed communists or people beholden to communists in their places from a position of strength. This process took place en masse throughout the country, from ministries and other central bodies to local national committees, associations, and interest organizations. The only exceptions where action committees were not allowed to be established were the army and the state police. Only the police could prevent this mass lawlessness, but they tolerated it because they themselves were already largely in the hands of the communists and actively participated in the coup d'etat. We can only estimate the number of people affected by the activities of the action committees. Communist statistics stated that during February and March 1948, around 30,000 people were affected by the purge, of whom almost 12,000 were state and public employees. Karel Kaplan, based on archival research, puts the figure at 250,000. The action committees removed 59,000 to 60,000 non-communist party members from national committees of all levels. More than 20,000 uncomfortable members had to leave their positions in trade union organizations. The Sokol physical education organization had about 15,000 officials removed. Some ended up in prison. Some 11,000 civil servants had to leave their jobs because of the pre-February political affiliations, and 294 of the 600 directors of nationalized enterprises, or almost half, had to leave their jobs. They were followed by an undisclosed number of members of the State Security and National Security Corps. 28% of officers were removed from the army. University teachers also had to leave, and 18% of the 48,000 university students did not pass the political purge. In their place, the Communist Party installed its own people, devoted to it without fail, and willing to serve it without any reservations. And all this in a short period of time following the February coup d'etat. The Czechoslovak public either approved of these measures or took passive note of them. However, removal from public life was not the only means of persecuting those who were inconvenient to the new regime. The action committees had the right to take away keys to their offices and other establishments, to confiscate their cash registers, documents, and stamps, to appoint supervisory bodies, and in the case of private enterprises or national administrations, to prevent their owners or administrators from disposing of their property. In some places, the action committees proceeded to withdraw trade licenses, hunting licenses, and gun licenses, to evict people from their apartments and houses, and even proceeded to revise farm allotments. There was also the public shaming of inconvenient people in the daily press and in the local environment on various bulletin boards and the like. The aim of all these dehumanizing actions, which the disabled had not the slightest chance of resisting, was not only to remove them from public life, but also to intimidate them and to deprive them of the determination to continue to resist the emerging totalitarianism. As a result, in a very short time, the communists succeeded in achieving their stated aim of not only controlling public life in the country and disarming their political opponents, but also reorganizing the political system of the National Front to their liking. Thank you for your attention.
Jestli jsem dobře pochopil, tak mohu poděkovat za referát.
Thank you very much for this interesting contribution. Thank you for recalling the external level from the takeover of the power to the state apparatus. Now we will move on to the final contribution presented by my dear colleague Adéla Gjuričová from the Institute for Contemporary History. Adéla is an author of many interesting publications, especially on the history of our nations after the 1989 Velvet Revolution. And I would especially like to mention her monograph with Tomáš Zahradníček, The Return of Parliament, Czechs and Slovaks in the Federal Assembly, 1989 to 1992. Her presentation is about representative councils in Socialist Czechoslovakia. The floor is yours. Thank you. And the topic is not very common. The idea for this paper came about while I was thinking about a longer text for an international project on state parties or party states in Eastern Europe and Asia. I was intrigued by the perspective from which the former Czechoslovak communist dictatorship can be viewed as a system that was long-lasting, resilient, and viable. And this effectiveness relied on the particular insertion of the Communist Party into the institutional structure of the state. So that's what I focused on. And I will in particular focus on the parliament and the national committees. In my paper, I will focus more narrowly on representative institutions, parliaments, national committees, what the Communist Party has used them for, symbolically and practically, how it has penetrated them, and why. In doing so, I will try to contribute to answering the question that observers from elsewhere often ask: why, when it had all the power, did the Communist Party actually maintain such a complex institutional structure of the state? Why the effort? This story has to be told since before the war, when the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia was in the National Assembly. We tend to view it as a thwarted electoral success, a potential diminished by intra-party disputes or pressure from Moscow, an activity of desolate protest, confused, shouted down. A closer look, however, will show, even in a party never officially admitted to participation in government policy, the systematic use of parliament as an important platform and of parliamentary salaries and immunity as a useful tool for political work, building a network of party cells or leading strikes and street protests. This process of learning culminated to some extent in the not very emphasized episode when Klement Gottwald, as well as other communist MPs, was still allowed to serve in the National Assembly for a few weeks after Munich. His speeches to the Parliamentary Standing Committee, according to which the whole nation had wished to fight if it had not been for the elements and forces which had deliberately prepared this shameful surrender for a long time, more than foreshadowed the post-war shift, and not only rhetorically. For my argument, what is crucial about the Third Republic is not only that the communists became a fully accepted and acceptable political player, even the initiator of fundamental systemic transformations. Moreover, they had mastered the tactic of a kind of displacement in space. On some issues, they were, in their own terms, a proud part of the National Front and its leading force, but on less successful ones, they withdrew from the National Front and pointed to its problems and limits. Jan Dobeš has documented in detail that it was Parliament that became the scene of some of the significant conflicts of that all-coalition arrangement, and even argues that in a sense it substituted for the existence of the opposition. In particular, in the Constituent Assembly, which emerged from the 1946 elections, one can observe cases where communist deputies and ministers invoked the autonomy of parliament, which came from the will of the people expressed in the elections, and rejected the participation of reactionary professors, that is, legal experts, in the drafting of the new constitution. But in the same way, a set of agricultural laws was first submitted to popular debate, and only then, together with resolutions from interest organizations and various ad hoc institutions, was it introduced into Parliament under pressure. Let's try for a moment to think of such a pragmatic approach to parliamentary institutions, not in moral terms, but in purely systemic terms. It would follow that the Communist Party had already tried out before February how it was possible to change the pace of revolutionary politics and to divert attention from substance to form and vice versa. Parliamentary institutions were an important laboratory for it in this. Although it had not yet mastered them, it had learned how to exploit or torpedo them as necessary. And when it gained control of them, it experimented with their optimal use. There were some impression of continuity, so that in spite of all the changes, it would be hard to say when exactly the whole system stopped being what contemporaries knew and when it became a dictatorship. So, in spite of the losses, there were these strange continuities, which meant that there were still enough people who had something to lose. So there was a dictatorship being built. We all know that the Communist Party created an apparatus that doubled the state structure, actually, including the ministries, agendas were created and decisions made in party organs. It was then up to the state ones to operationalize and execute them in the legislature or at the appropriate level of the executive. Party apparatus personnel and party members in other institutions may have sometimes overlapped in personnel, but they understood the difference in where they were currently sitting and in what mode, and this soon proved important. The party's gaze turned to representative institutions in a new way before the mid-1960s in response to the economic and political crisis. The admiration for technological innovation and technocratic management translated into a demand for, I quote, higher professional standards and a general deepening of the activity of national committees and the central organs of the state. After the 1964 elections, new people were put in charge of the National Assembly and its committees in order to intensify the work of the parliament and to enable deputies to strengthen their control function vis-à-vis the government. The very gradual and not very obvious self-parliamentarization of the non-freely elected parliament, and this is a term used by Tomáš Zahradníček and myself for the parliament in the 89 revolution, but also by Bettina Tüffers. So this self-parliamentarization became fully apparent during the Prague Spring, as we know from Jiří's work, and it culminated a few days after the 21st of August, when a large number of deputies fortified themselves in the then temporary seat on Senvážné Square, declared the National Assembly the only legitimate supreme state organ, and issued protest statements addressed to the parliaments of the occupying states. What is important about this is not only the emancipation of state organs, but also the recognition that the Communist Party could benefit from shifting public opinion to the state-like of the state party. This can come in handy in moments of crisis. On YouTube, you probably see the picture. It's a view from the building of the National Assembly, and this really shows the atmosphere of the Communist Parliament of the 1960s. So it was on the same level as the Prague Castle. The Praguers' project was supposed to reflect the liberated parliament. Of course, this was all cancelled by normalization. So the beginnings of normalization also marked a different phase in the history of socialist parliaments. Their role was now to embody some important features of the new order. It was in these institutions that the representation of doctrinally relevant age, occupational, gender, and ethnic categories was most easily demonstrated. Parliaments and plenums of national committees also expressed in a particularly dignified way the rhythm of electoral periods and the implementation of electoral programs, approved plans, and state final accounts. Finally, the very existence of the trio of new parliaments, the Federal Assembly with its two distinct chambers, and the Czech and Slovak national councils, was to embody and end with the new federal structure of Czechoslovakia. After the mid-1980s, another profound crisis of support for bureaucratic organization was evident, and representative councils were called back into action. In the understanding of the Czechoslovak communists, this was still a relatively little feared part of Gorbachev's perestroika. His call for the return of power to the Soviets, restoring their original Leninist functionality and importance, led to fundamental changes in the Soviet Union, including extensive institutional parliamentary reform. In Czechoslovakia, the representative bodies were instructed to deepen their activities and strengthen their role. Certain parliamentary sessions were evaluated in terms of the quality of the contributions to debate and how well they expressed the spirit of openness. The rules of procedure were changed and the status of deputies was emphasized. There was even an experiment in early 1989 with by-elections in which voters chose from among several candidates. National committees at all levels were changing long-established habits. The revised rules of procedure were intended to allow a freer exchange of ideas and opinions. There were even advisory commissions that were to reflect the pressing problems that actually existed. All state bodies were to assist in economic reconstruction, and the national committees transformed their transport, horticulture, or design contribution organizations into state enterprises. New media images of heated discussions in parliamentary committees, such as the TV series Before MPs Agree and Vote, were created, making it easy to forget that any party leadership had ever existed. There was an exciting parliamentary world. Again, at the same time as the directive was being carried out, the various branches of state power were using it for their own emancipation. This is also why there were voices in both national councils drawing attention to national identity and responsibility. And the way the new constitution was adopted was already being discussed in the Slovak National Council. In November 1989, the Prime Minister of the federal government, on his own and without a mandate from his party, negotiated with the opposition, but without sitting in and controlling the federal parliament that was supposed to approve the systematic changes. We have described it with Tomáš Zahradníček, how the parliament briefly rebelled. So, to conclude, in addition to the formality, emptiness, and bureaucratic nature of state representative bodies, it's also necessary to see the functionality and effectiveness of this strange and changing symbiosis of party and state structures. Communist Party has repeatedly found ways to redirect attention to the pillar of the whole state structure, the representative bodies or the president, and to its improvement or self-improvement. Thus, from an institutional point of view, the complex structure of the communist dictatorship had a deeper meaning than simply maintaining a kind of legal or democratic facade. This distancing from the state, placing responsibility or blame on it, was used by the party as an effective tool in moments of crisis. It was something that it had learned in part before the war, tried extensively during the Third Republic, and used several times in the 40 years after February. The fall of the communist dictatorship can thus also be seen as a failure of this skill or its takeover by someone else. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you too. Thank you for all your presentations and for the effort you made to create these. For an outside viewer, it might seem that these presentations focused on different areas, different activities of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia. Some perhaps could be seen as marginal, but helped to the stabilization of the Communist Party. Your contributions and contributions about Slovak communists and the post-1948 events showed that the possibility of experience with parliamentarism failed. I would be very happy if we could continue our panel and continue to our Q&A session. We do have here some questions sent to us. And we have here a question from Jiří Svatoš for Professor Pernes, which says, I would like to ask about the role of the revived Czechoslovak People's Party and Czechoslovak Socialist Party. You mentioned their subordination to the Communist Party. In the months after the February events, did these parties have limited powers, at least in partial matters concerning, for example, the departments they administered in the revived government of Klement Gottwald? What was the role of the revived parties after the 1948 coup d'etat? I would say that the non-communist parties were totally frozen by the crisis and by the coup d'etat in February 1948, and their existence was purely symbolic. They lost most of their members. In 1968, the Czechoslovak Socialist Party only had some 10,000 members. A similar Slovak party had just enough members to cover the apparatus it had. In national committees, there were very few members from these parties, because in February 1948, the leadership of these parties banned its members from entering the National Front, and only a very small percentage of its members did so. So, following 1948, these parties didn't participate much at the public life. Emanuel Šlechta, the Minister of Industry, of Plojhar, Ministry of Health, were not obstructed at all in their functions. They were there with the knowledge of the Communist Party, so the apparatus was working the way it should. I'm not sure that all of my colleagues want to add something, but they can. Thank you for your answer, Jiří. And we have other questions. One is for Docent Syrný, and it asks whether Docent Syrný could describe the circumstances of merging the Communist Slovak Party and the Slovak Social Democracy in 1944. Following Munich in 1938 and the disintegration of the Republic meant also disintegration of the Social Democratic Party and the two main representatives of the Slovak Social Democracy, who were also representatives of the idea of Czechoslovakia. They remained in Prague because they knew that they would be persecuted by the new regime in Slovakia. It was a more enemy-like environment than that they would encounter in Prague. The leadership that remained lost the drive because they didn't know how to change their orientation. They were not able to accept the idea of the disintegration of Czechoslovak state. And also that if the Czechoslovak state was renewed, it would be at least as a federation. All the members that were young and radical had somehow closer to the Communist Party, and Social Democrats who were older somehow spread between other parties. The most important group surrounding the Slovak Social Democrats was active when it came to the idea of unification. But they were not so strong. It was not a party that would have much strength. They were happy with the promise to be an equal partner, and this was kept at the beginning. The Czech side saw it as too radical. Gottwald and the Czech Social Democrats said, yes, perhaps we'll do something similar in the future in the Czech part of the state, and they were enthusiastic about the ambience, but they also saw the negative parts. If there was a survey of how many Social Democrats really changed their affiliation, then perhaps it would be to the advantage of the Communist Party. Thank you for the question and the answer too. We have another two questions. One is from our colleague Wojciech Rybka to Adéla. I quote, is it possible to imagine a functionalist approach that would replace the period names, including parliament, with another more technical term? What would be the disadvantages? See, for example, people's democracy versus dictatorship. And another question by Matej Bílý to Adéla too. Would you agree that since the mid-1970s, there has been an effort by the Eastern Bloc countries to present their parliaments on the international scene as increasingly important institutions? If so, was the main reason to create another channel for dialogue with Western states? Thank you for these interesting questions, but I don't have pre-prepared answers to that. To use the word parliament for the representative corpses is quite difficult. Communists also discussed this matter. When Smrkovský was elected the president of the National Assembly, he starts with parliament, he uses the word parliamentarism, he uses the word as a weapon within the communist discussion. So it was a word that was used for some time, and it's something that we do within our group that studies this matter, and it started in fact as a provocation also within the European discussion of historians who studied different European parliamentary cultures, but to start with, they limited themselves to the Western democracies. They sort of didn't know almost that we had here parliamentary structures too. But to say people's dictatorship and how to call a parliament in such case, I would have to really think about it, give it a thought. We now use simply the word parliament. Sometimes we use some attributes to it, but so far we didn't really give it much thought. As to the question of Matej Bílý, I think that's a very interesting question, because yes, we are much present on the international scene in the mid-1970s and onwards. And some organizations we joined, some we didn't become members of. They always raised the question of human rights, and they had to somehow deal with it in the final report. And then there was the Polish risk, where there was parliament, the process of having a parliament, and it seemed as a huge danger from the point of view from here. So yes, parliament could be seen as something stronger and sort of taking away the attention from the party's pillar to a more dignified institution of the Federal Assembly. Thank you for your answers. As I was listening to your contributions, I have two questions to our colleagues. I would first like to ask Mr. Holubec, what was, when it comes to the anarchists joining the Communist Party, and I mean here the group around Stanislav Kostka-Neumann. And then a question for Petr, Anev, and the support of Bubnik's group from the castle. I know that you also deal with the National Workers' Party, and if they were close to President Beneš and Jan Masaryk, so did they follow the developments? Did they see what the issues were of this new phenomenon on the political party and non-traditional one?
If it's okay, I will not switch on my camera because I have a bad connection. It's true that part of the anarchists around S.K. Neumann entered the KSČ after its creation quite early, mainly the North Bohemian groups that were more radical. The group around Vrbenský joined only after 1925. It seems they did not communicate much anymore because the KSČ prevented the creation of any intra-party platforms. They knew each other from before the First World War, so they were going to meet, but it was not possible. I explained this by the fact that the anarchist identity that was strong before the First World War, after the creation of Czechoslovakia, it kind of disappeared because anarchists started admiring the Bolshevik revolution and did not identify anymore with the notion of anarchists. Even before the war, they started calling themselves anarchist communists. So for them, anarchism was something from the past, and they were living for the communist revolution. When the Bolsheviks suppressed anarchist uprisings in Ukraine, there were no critical voices in the Czech environment. The anarchists were very enthusiastic towards the Bolshevik revolution. They also accepted Marx. They refused before the war
ten anarchismus slovanský, ten socialismus slovanský, to znamená
they promoted or supported Bakunin.
Oni tedy se přiklonili i tady přijali Marxe. Takže vlastně
Then they changed their mind and they supported Marx. So there was no anarchist group in the interwar period. There was a small attempt, but it did not amount to anything. And a majority of anarchists joined the KSČ.
Zřejmě se nám teďka ke konci přerušilo spojení a možná, jestli to správně chápu, bylo to také zakončení vaší odpovědi.
Yes.
Bych vás tedy přerušil a
I'm not sure if we lost you or if it was the end of your answer. Petr, Anev, could you please answer the question? So, as for the personalities of the Labour Party, as far as I know, they did not reflect the developments in the communist movement, but as for the people around the castle, Edvard Beneš and others were hoping that the Independent Communist Party would win at least several mandates. That's why they tried to support Bubník and his group. There was also Jiří Stříbrný. When he and Edvard Beneš were still members of the Social Democrat Party, they sent money to Slovak communists and they were expecting some success. Thank you very much. We have another question for
Jaký vliv měla marxistická ideologie na prorůstání komunistické
Adéla Gjuričová from Petra Vesela. The question is, what influence did Marxist ideology have on the penetration of the Communist Party into the institutional structure of the state? Oh, that's a big question. The funny thing is that the original Marxist ideology was very strict towards the parliament, and all state institutions were seen as a tool of the ruling class. So it was forbidden to adopt a pragmatic position towards them. Lenin quotes Marx in State and Revolution, saying that the parliaments are all about deciding every few years which part of the ruling class will rule the working class. But then Lenin decided to use the state. He found an interpretation of Marx for a time when he would not abolish the state, but on the contrary, make it very strong. We can see this throughout the history of the communist movement, and my colleagues who are sitting here could speak lengthily about this. After the war in Czechoslovakia, the compromise is already done. Thank you very much for this beautiful answer. If there is anyone else who would like to comment, I would like to remind you that you can also ask questions among yourselves, because your contributions had many common topics, common points. I also have a question for Mr. Syrný and Mr. Pernes. So first, Marek, Syrný, I have a question linked to the post-war development in Slovakia. So there was the change in leadership. The new leadership consisted of people who were closer to the central leadership of the Communist Party of Czechoslovakia, like Karol Macílek, William Široký, and others. This can give the impression that there were new officials, but my question is, were they somehow tied to the pre-war KSČ leadership and to Bolshevization, because they couldn't appear suddenly out of the blue? And my question for Jiří Pernes is the following. Many of us know that you had the opportunity to study the former Soviet archives in Moscow. What was the position of the Soviet leadership towards the transformation of the party as a holder of the power? For example, compared to Poland or Hungary, the revolution happened very quickly in Czechoslovakia and it was very successful. And it followed the model of the Bolshevik power takeover, including the new legitimate committees that carried out purges, persecutions, arrestations, really changing the political structure on all levels that were mentioned here. Was this somehow reflected critically by Moscow? Marek, Syrný? Okay, let me start.
Sa vzťahuje k tomu vedeniu, ktoré bolo dovtedy, to znamená, že k tomu povstaleckému, alebo teda k tomu, ktoré bolo počas povstania krátko po vojne. Ono sú to všetko samozrejme už starí harcovníci komunistickej strany, ktorí boli vo vedení už istý čas pred vojnou. Či už je to Marek, člen jeden zo zakladajúcich členov komunistickej strany.
So be it the founding members of the Communist Party in Slovakia, William Široký was deputy of the parliament, Julius Barcilek, they were important representatives of the party in Slovakia also before the war. Then Barcilek and others went to exile to Moscow. Široký and Gjurič spent most of the war in prison. And what actually led the Communist Party to Slovakia could be compared to Husak's group. It was young people aged between 30 to 40, a generation younger than the old comrades before the war. These were people who had a university degree. So theoretically speaking, we could describe them as a national intellectual group surrounding Husak, and then older members from workers' environment and who spent most of their life in party structures. Of course, they knew Klement Gottwald from before the war, and when it comes to opinions and ideas, they were closer to him than those young intellectuals who studied at universities. Just a small remark to understand the difference. The elder revolutionary leadership, let's say those who were taught from Lenin. So at first, then of course, on the 1st of May, you go into the streets and you have to spread public criticism, hand out flyers, and so on. Husák, who was a young lawyer back then, he worked in Clementi's office, and he was responsible for organizing the students to have them hand flyers and so on. So Husák opposed it. He said that this was pointless, it had no meaning, and thought that it brought nothing to the party in the future. Of course, this led to conclusions that this was not the right attitude and it was due to his social standing. But this way of waiting of his, and so couldn't bring him any closer to Gottwald. They weren't so disciplined as their predecessors were. Thank you. Thank you for this interesting answer. And now I would like to ask Jiří Pernes to answer the question. Before answering the question, I would also like to ask Dr. Syrný one question. You mentioned the lessening of the importance of the Slovak Communist Party following the events of 1948. So, under the conditions of the Communist International, there could be only one Communist Party in each state. So that was true in Czechoslovakia until its disintegration, which then followed by the creation of the Slovak Communist Party, which existed until 1945, and it kept on existing after 1945. And I found in the Russian archives that after 1948, there was a pressure made on the leadership of KSČ to unify the leadership of the Slovak and the Czech Communist Party. And the Slovak Communist Party was declared a regional unit of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. Materials and so on sent to the central committee were sent to these instances in Slovakia. I haven't studied the Slovakian archives, but I would like to know whether the leadership of the Slovak Communist Party reacted to this reunion of the two parties. And I would also like to answer to Jiří Kocian. Yes, so the successful coup d'etat in February 1948 was evaluated quite negatively. As early as April 1948, the Department of International Relations of the Bolsheviks created material entitled "About Some Mistakes of the Czechoslovak Communist Party." So it sounds almost as an accusation, and they criticized Gottwald, Slansky, Švermová, and others, pointing out the policy of the specific Czechoslovak way to communism, the policy of the open doors that led to KSČ having over 2.5 million members. The Soviet comrades saw it as lessening the character of the Czechoslovak Communist Party and going beyond the class. They criticized the nation policy against Hungarians and the Slovaks. Klement Gottwald himself had a very unpleasant experience with this. He went to the Crimea in 1947 and he was a leader of the opposition party. And then in 1948 he came as a socialist communist Czechoslovakia, and he hoped that Stalin would praise him, but the opposite was true, and in compliance with the material, Stalin sort of was very unpleasant with him. So the Soviet evaluation of February 1948 wasn't positive to start with, and they pressured the party to give up on the idea of specific Czechoslovak way, and they wanted them to increase the class struggle. Thank you. I will answer your question whether the Soviet party pressured for the unification of the Slovak and the Czech Communist Party. I don't know much about that, but what you mentioned on the practical and formal level, when you look from the outside at the functioning of the party, then the party was independent during the war and totally autonomous, independent after the war. So it could be called the so-called Communist Party. As far as the relationship to outside actors is concerned, be it Moscow or others, then the party was always viewed as part of the Czechoslovak Communist Party. It was never viewed as a possibly independent party with its own leadership, or at the best, it was viewed as something temporary. In the nationalist ambience of the 1939, it could seem as possible to some, but it was not. In any case, nor Prague or Moscow accepted that this could be a stable situation, which is why Jiří and Schmidtke were sent to reduce the influx of the social nationalism. And they said in Moscow, this is still Czechoslovakia, it's still the Czechoslovak Communist Party, although temporary things are different. After the war, it was to be one party within the national front, because they would also lose votes if it were two parties. So So since 1945, they seem independent, but in fact, they are not. They are subordinate to the Czechoslovak party. So when there was a Republic Congress, then it was always about the Czechoslovak party, and it was not dealt with separately. So if there is a mention in Russian or Soviet archives about these things, I wouldn't say that it would lead to Prague trying to establish Slovak communists as an independent entity. Of course, the older members took the subordination to Prague for granted. They didn't see it as an issue because they felt there were higher goals, and they were waiting for the seizure of power to eventually deal with other things.
Když sledují čas, tak se mi nechce věřit, že nám to tak...
Thank you for answering the question. And I'm surprised when I look at the time, because and now I have a question for Adéla Gjuričová. One more question. So if we have no more questions from the viewers or from the panelists, we will close the panel after my last question to Adéla Gjuričová. I once had the opportunity to look into some funds and archives about the activities of different parliamentary committees in 64 to 68, and it was about enlivening the culture and social life, but there were sometimes also very sharp questions from MPs regarding the everyday needs of life, like housing policy, the length of maternity leave, building of flats, further education, vocational schools. Did the Communist Party leadership reflect these questions related to what you so nicely call the self-parliamentarization? Okay, I will try to be brief. This is self-parliamentarization for sure, because the committees were a place where people could speak very openly, but it didn't go out of these committees. It remained there. The same thing happened in the second half of the 1980s. So a minister or deputy minister came to the meeting of this committee, and they were criticized by the members of the committee. It was always the state that was accused. The party leaders always said, or the minister said, yeah, it's the state. It was, but it was not the right people who were grilled, so to speak, in the committees. It was never the party leaders It was actually very advantageous for the party to have these lively discussions and criticism in the committees, but it didn't lead anywhere. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues, dear viewers of this panel, many thanks to all of you for being with us. Many thanks to the panelists for their contributions, for the discussion. Namely, I'd like to thank the docent Holubec, Syrný, Dr. Gjuričová, all our panelists, Mr. Anev. I would also like to thank our IT support, all our colleagues in the Institute, Ms. Macurková, Ms. Novotná, Mr. Váňa. Many thanks to the interpreters. That's also very important. And last but not least, I'd like to thank my close collaborator who spent the whole afternoon here with me, Lucie Marková, who was a great support for me. I would also like to invite you to the continuation of the conference tomorrow morning. That is the third panel about the tools of power dominance, Czechoslovak communism as an executor as well as a victim of repressions. And please think about the possibility of sending your contributions, your written contributions for the publication in our collection. So it was really nice seeing you here, and I hope to see some of you again tomorrow. Thank you very much and have a nice evening. Goodbye.